let's continue to interrogate patriarchy, or this patriarchal thesis, rather. Are men really interested in oppressing women? You can ask yourself that. If you're a man, just ask yourself, do I really want to keep women under my feet? You know women in your life. You have a mother, you might have a wife, you might have daughters, you might have sisters, aunts on your maternal or paternal side. Are you interested in oppressing these women? Do you feel the urge to subjugate them for your own benefit? Ask yourself that as a man. And if you're like most men, the answer will be no. In fact, you have this urge to protect women. You feel that women are more vulnerable, and you have taken it upon yourself, perhaps, in your own life to take care of these women and protect them. You'd be even willing to sacrifice your own life for these women. What wouldn't you do for your mother? What wouldn't you do for your daughter? How much do you love your wife? How much do you love the female members of your family? The feminist thesis, the patriarchal thesis, says that you actually, as a man, don't care about these women. You would prefer to subjugate them for your own selfish needs, to prioritize your desires over what they need. And this is why you engage in whatever. That is the patriarchal thesis, but this doesn't accord with your experience as a man. If you are 99% of men, this does not accord with your phenomenology, your experience, your feelings. Now, if you're a woman, you can also ask this question. Does it seem like your father, your husband, your sons, your uncles, other male family members, does it seem like they really want to oppress you? Now, the problem with asking that question is, and I mean, the same could be said for asking men this question as well, you might be indoctrinated by this feminist ideology. Through years of conditioning, years of programming, you actually have this kind of distrust of men and suspicion of men, and in many cases it's probably not justified. Are there some cases where it is justified? Sure, absolutely. I'm not here trying to argue that men are without sin and that there is no evil man in existence. That is false. There clearly are evil men, and men who will abuse people in their lives for their own advantage, men who prey on the weak, men who prey on the vulnerable. Yes, of course, there are men like this, and there are also women like this. And I ask, whenever I'm confronted with someone who is a feminist, I will ask them a very honest question, or a very straightforward, easy to answer question. It doesn't require being a graduate student or a PhD or having any particular expertise. Just reflect on your own life and think, okay, you might have an experience with a bad man, an evil man, a selfish man. Is there no woman that you have seen or experienced in your life who is also malicious, who has also been selfish, who has also treated others around her poorly, taken advantage of people around her? And any honest person will admit that actually, yeah, there are examples of women who display this kind of self-centered behavior, oppressive behavior, abusive behavior. Yeah, I actually do know people like that. And the really honest people will recognize that actually there seems to be an even distribution of people between the genders who fit that kind of profile. For me, that's my experience, and people that I talk to, many of them will admit that actually, right, now that I think about it, in much more careful and explicit terms, if I were to be honest and do a tally of the people that I know who fit that kind of psychological or personality profile, it's pretty even between men and women. Even within Muslim families, arguably, when it comes to malicious figures, you'll find more Muslim women who fit that profile, who actually abuse and are oppressive towards their husbands, towards their children, towards other family members. And some people will recognize that, yeah, I know people like that in my family. So doesn't this completely belie this patriarchal thesis? We don't have to. What I'm trying to appeal to is your own personal experience and simple reflection. The goal of feminism is to put this kind of frame on everything so that you interpret all of your life experience according to that frame. We need to break that frame. And when we do and analyze our own lives more honestly, we realize how false that framing of feminism is. And it's also irrational. It's also irrational for the reasons that I mentioned in the previous module, but also for another reason that we'll talk about, for several of the reasons that we'll talk about. Are men more willing than women to oppress others? Ask yourself that question, because if the answer is yes, that seems like sexism. Why should men be more predisposed to oppression, abuse, maliciousness, injustice? Isn't that a sexist characterization that is contrary to feminist ideals or stated ideals? For a movement or an ideology that is so concerned about establishing the absolute equality of the sexes, isn't it curious? Isn't it bizarre that the entire project is based on this assumption that one sex is more malicious or is more prone to abuse or more prone to maliciousness? Now, you'll have the feminists respond and say, no. The men who are acting unjustly and oppressing women through patriarchy, it's because those men themselves have been victims of the patriarchy. And they have been socialized to think and behave and react according to patriarchal norms that they have inherited. This is the feminist response. But this response doesn't logically work, because you can ask, okay, well, you've only put the problem back one generation, because we can ask with the previous generation, the men of that generation are more predisposed to evil and injustice, and the feminists will say, no, they are also the product of a prior patriarchy. Okay, so you're just pushing the problem one generation back. You can't do that or indefinitely. The buck has to stop somewhere. Who was the first patriarch? Who was the first evil, unjust man or group of men? And you'll have, as a feminist, you'll have to be committed to the fact that that group of men was naturally, or for whatever reason, more predisposed to injustice than the women. And so that is sexism. That is sexism in your entire ideology and belief system. These are the kinds of contradictions that are rational, logical, that you can point out to undermine this patriarchal thesis. It doesn't make any sense. So even if men, here's another point, even if men did want to oppress and subjugate women, I mean, just think about how ludicrous that is. Like, the whole idea is that I, as a man, prefer other men over my own female family members. Like, I am going to throw my daughter, for example, under the bus because I have some kind of alliance with other men, strange men in society, and I'm going to collude with those other men in a kind of patriarchal conspiracy to keep women down. My own daughter, my wife, my mother. I want to keep them down for the sake or for the benefit of other men, strangers within society. How ridiculous is that? How nonsensical is that? But let's just play along and assume, okay, there are men, there are a lot of men who are fine with subjugating their own family members for the sake of strangers. Okay. How would this subjugation work? How could men subjugate these members of their family? Because the reality is, if you are married, your wife is living with you. She is in the same household. She is in the same, bed oftentimes, right? How are you going to create a situation of subjugation where you are enjoying the benefits of increased power, increased wealth, all of the wealth that you have pilfered from the poor, defenseless, vulnerable women of society, all the privilege that you've been able to suck out of these poor women? How are you going to enjoy that and keep your female family members away from that? How are you going to create that kind of partition or that kind of segregation within your own home? It's not possible. It's logistically not possible. So we've left the realm of what is logically possible, what is theoretically possible, and now we're even in looking at the logistics, the nitty-gritty. How are you going to keep all of the privilege and wealth and influence that you've accumulated as a man and keep that away from your female family members who are living in your same house? If we want to analyze this kind of distribution of wealth and power, yeah, there are many societies throughout history where one group has taken advantage of another group. One group has oppressed another group. One group has taken advantage of another group. But the group in power spends a lot logistically to maintain separation, to create a whole structure of advantage for their own group and the disadvantage of the out group. That takes a lot of resources. It takes a lot of infrastructure. It takes a lot of coordination. It takes a lot of resources. But that's what you need to create in order to maintain the power differential, the wealth differential. Otherwise, the people who are being taken advantage of are going to rebel. They're going to exercise their various means to retake and recapture their the wealth that they have lost unjustly. Right? And so this is something that we see throughout history, and many different historians from different intellectual persuasions will argue this and will point this out, whether it's Marxists, a Marxist analysis, or even certain capitalists will point this out. Certain historians, even Ibn Khaldun, will point something like this out. But how can that happen? That kind of analysis, how can it be extended to gender relations? Because when we look at historically, the group that has taken power and has taken advantage of other groups, that group includes both genders. Because the wealthy and powerful, when they steal, and those who do steal and those who are corrupt and they take advantage, they are taking advantage for themselves and their household and their extended family and their friends, which all include both genders. It includes both genders. For every, dictator that you have the dictator's wife. For every barbaric, authoritarian oppressor you have the oppressor's wife. And so they are also taking advantage. They're also living in the castle. They're living with the wealth and the privilege as well. So they're part of the oppressive class. This is the one way that you can analyze it. But feminism has this bizarre myth that it weaves for us that says that no, you can have men who are preferring and conspiring and colluding with other men to take advantage and to oppress people within their own household. How is that logistically possible. It's not. It's not. So you can't apply the same kind of class warfare, class conflict analysis to the family or to history of the genders. It's logistically not possible. The other major criticism that we can give against this patriarchal thesis is it's self-defeating. It's self-defeating in the sense that this oppression of women has existed for tens of thousands of years, maybe hundreds of thousands of years. And where are the women who have protested this? Feminists will argue that, oh, there are many women who throughout history have asked for more rights. And they will point to different examples and say, oh, well, look at, Joan of Arc. or they'll say, look at Khadija, radiallahu anha, or Aisha, radiallahu anha. And they'll quote some cherry-picked statement and they'll say, oh, this is the feminism of the past. This is all anachronism. This is all a projection, an illegitimate projection of the present onto the past. In fact, you won't find any expression of the patriarchal thesis by anyone in the past. No woman of the past has said, yeah, there is this system of oppression by men subjugating women. You won't find a historical example of this. Again, you can find examples of women who might protest a certain kind of treatment. You might have women who say, this is not fair, pointing to very specific, explicit, self-contained issues prior to modernity. But you'll never find anything prior to modernity, prior to the feminist movement, that says there is this patriarchy, this overarching system that is systematically abusing women. There's no example of that until the feminist movement. How do you explain this? Is it because all of these women of the past were too ignorant? They didn't realize the system of oppression that was subjugating them? Were these women too ignorant? Were these women just so blind and dumb that they couldn't understand how they were being exploited? That seems to be the message of feminism. That the feminists, modern feminists, are, whether they're doing it knowingly or unknowingly, wittingly or unwittingly, they are putting down women of all of these past generations. They are insulting the women of all of these past generations, all women in pre-modernity, and saying that these women were essentially ignorant. They are ignorant. They were also incapable because they were never able to rise up and defeat the men who are keeping them down. Isn't this misogynistic to paint women with such a brush and to portray the millions and billions of women of history as being so impotent, powerless, ignorant? And only the modern woman understands the patriarchy and the abuse that women suffer as a class, as a gender, due to structural patriarchy. This is a very contradictory, self-contradictory thesis. It's self-defeating. Also, the patriarchal thesis portraying women across all of history as being subjugated to men due to this patriarchy. Women are according to this feminist understanding, women are the only class of people ever to have been universally the victims of oppression. What other group, what other race, what other ethnicity has been perpetually a victim? Perpetually bamboozled, perpetually kept in the dark, perpetually under the foot if there were such groups that are perpetually in this state of victimhood, that's kind of insulting. That's kind of, like I said, it's painting them in a very bad light. But there's no other group. There's no other group like that. Only women. Only women meet that profile because this is what feminism, according to feminism, that's the history. But what about black people? This is, I've actually, when I make this point in other lectures, you'll inevitably have a feminist, say, oh, but what about black people? Black people have also been universally oppressed. That's false. That's false. As far as different races go, there has been no race, and certainly not Africans, that have been universally oppressed. In fact, throughout history, at certain times, the African nations were the superior in terms of their worldly power. Look at the Berbers. Look at the different empires within the Mali Empire in sub-Saharan Africa. Look at Uthman Dan Fodio. Look at all of these emperors and empires. These were all African empires, and they were in a position of superiority. They were, in fact, subjugating and enslaving other groups. The Berbers, at one point, were even enslaving Europeans, white Europeans. And they were, called pirates, the Berberi pirates. So this is historically not the case, that you had Africans, blacks, they've always been oppressed and subjugated. No, that's a falsehood. There is no race that has always been in this kind of position of subservience. It's only women somehow, if we believe this. And that's a very demeaning portrayal of women. So feminism has to contend with the fact that their own thesis undermines and insults and demeans and degrades women. Another kind of conceptual point is, if men and women are equal in intelligence, in ability, and capability, how did patriarchy arise in the first place? Because what women will say when it comes to the intelligence question, for example, the differences in IQ, or the differences in aggressiveness, or the differences in a lot of the personality traits between the genders, between men and women, they'll say these are all a result of socialization. And if we could create a society that did not have gender bias, we could actually create a perfectly equal feminist utopia. This is the claim that they make. But let's analyze this a little bit conceptually and ask, okay, well, what about the difference in strength between men and women? Even if you had a society where you give the little girls toy guns and cars and trucks and blocks, and you give the boys dolls and teacups and dresses, and you try to abolish any kind of gender preference within society and the raising of children, imagine that you could dissolve some of these gender stereotypes. Still, the boys would grow up bigger, they'd have bigger muscles, they'd be taller, they'd be more aggressive maybe, because a lot of aggression has to do with the hormone testosterone, and men just biologically have more than that. So you'd still have a situation where men are being more aggressive, despite all the socialization, the feminist socialization that you've created. Isn't that going to reproduce all of the patriarchal practices and institutions that feminism wants to abolish? The feminists will say, well, no, because you have to start the socialization at a certain point in history. If you go far back enough in time, you'll reach a point where men actually were not necessarily physically stronger than women. Men in the evolutionary chain at one point were just the same size physically and mentally. Everything was the same between genders. And it was only because those hunter and gatherer societies pushed the males to go hunt. If they had pushed the females to go hunt and catch dinner, then the women would have gotten stronger with bigger muscles. They would have been faster. They would have had more strategic thinking. And we would have found this evolutionary history where women would end up becoming bigger, stronger, more aggressive than men. So it ultimately goes back to socialization. Okay, well, again, we come to this question. Why did that hypothetical hunter and gatherer society, why did they push the men to go and be hunters? Why weren't they equal and even-handed and say, no, both male and female go do the hunting? Why were they, it seems like the feminist is portraying these hunter and gatherer societies as patriarchal. But this is begging the question because we're trying to understand the origins of patriarchy. If men and women are equal and men and women have all of the same attitudes and personality, that's what we're trying to explain. But what you have stated as a feminist, but with this hypothetical hunter and gatherer society, you have cooked the books, basically. You have given me a hypothetical society that already has these patriarchal attitudes or has a kind of gender differentiation or a gender bias. That's what you're trying to explain, but you've assumed it within the hypothetical scenario that you've given. So you haven't really addressed the question. You've only, once again, tried to push it back, but it doesn't make logical sense. The whole point is, where does this original gender differentiation arise from? The feminist constantly wants to say it's socialization. It's socialization. You just have to go far back in time to come to the first instance of socialization, and that will explain everything else. That will explain the patriarchy that has happened since time immemorial. But do you see the logical problem with this? Because if you go far back in time and you claim that there was a first patriarch, a first patriarchal society, that's what you're trying to explain, but you've assumed it. You've just tried to move it further back in time. The reality is that male and female are biologically different. So there's going to be differences inevitably in behavior and attitudes. Why? Because women get pregnant and men are the ones who impregnate. And this has significant consequences for everything related to human biology. And when we come to the module about human biology, we'll elaborate on this more. So these are many reasons why the patriarchal thesis is completely false. And as Muslims, we should not accept this. We should not accept the patriarchal thesis. We should not try to reproduce the patriarchal thesis by talking about Jahiliyyah being, some kind of oppressive situation for women, and then Islam liberating women in the same way that feminists talk about how modern feminism has liberated women from the patriarchal, oppressive past. No, women have been treated well, and in general have been treated as having equal value and equal worth in general over the course of history. Yeah, there are examples where women have been mistreated or they've been treated as inhuman and treated inhumanely. Yeah, there are examples like that. But over the course of the entirety of history, under the weight of the entirety of history, women are not stupid. Okay, as Muslims, we don't have this kind of idea of women as being incompetent or incapable. Yeah, women are not as physically capable as men, but in terms of emotions, in terms of being able to manipulate others emotionally, women have a lot more ability on average than men do, and this can be used to great advantage. And that's why you see, granted, you'll have perhaps more physical abuse, like more damaging physical abuse from malicious, evil, unjust men. With women, you'll have more emotional abuse, which can be just as devastating for anyone who is a victim of emotional abuse. Just because your bones aren't breaking, that doesn't mean that emotional abuse is a walk in the park. No. The evil man might break your bones, but the evil woman will break your heart, will break your soul. That is the power that women have always had, and this is attested to even in the Quran. The power of the wife of the Emir in Surah Yusuf, for example, who tried to seduce Yusuf alayhi salam. Her power was not in her physical strength. Her power was in her ability to manipulate emotionally others and to deceive. And she was able to create so much problems for a Nabi, a man who is, mashallah, the Prophet Yusuf alayhi salam. She was able to do that through her ability to manipulate. So as Muslims, we don't think that women are just this, yeah, they're physically weaker, but in terms of their capabilities, in terms of outsmarting men or being able to manipulate men, working situation for their benefit, for their advantage, women have always been capable of that. And this is, very clear in just the way that Allah creates everything. If Allah creates a small animal, like a small cat, He also gives the cat claws, right? If Allah makes a certain kind of bird that's easy to be killed, He also makes sure that the bird is fast in flight. Allah gives abilities to all of His creatures to be able to survive and thrive in the dunya, and male and female is no different. So we have to have a more nuanced, a richer, deeper understanding, and not buy this feminist garbage that, oh, women are this meek, innocent creatures, and men are these violent, abusive, oppressive beasts who have created a system of patriarchy just for the sole purpose of taking advantage of women. No, the patriarchy exists, and this is a system that is coming from what Allah has legislated through revelation, and it's also embedded in human nature. The authority of men and the control of men in political, in terms of political leadership, leadership of the family, and so forth. There's great wisdom in this, and if you want a lot of details on this, go and take the course Vanishing Throne, and we go into a lot of that in depth. Also, Hero's Call, about masculinity and reclaiming masculinity. These are courses that will go into details on these issues. So in further modules, we're going to talk about biology, politics, and so forth.